Dr. Ava Bennett sat in the crowded waiting area of the courthouse, tapping her fingers lightly on the armrest of the stiff wooden chair. The place smelled faintly of stale coffee, and the murmur of other cases being called filled the room. Today's visit was supposed to be brief, just a minor parking violation for leaving her car in a no-parking zone while she ran into the local pharmacy to pick up a prescription. It had been an oversight, nothing more. She'd never been one to break rules. She always made sure everything was in order. But this time, the rush to get back to her office had led to a small mistake. As she looked around the room, Dr. Bennett noted how few people seemed to even acknowledge her presence. It was a town she didn't visit often, one she had never considered important in her long, illustrious career. She was used to walking into rooms where her name carried weight, where people knew who she was. She was a leading figure in the world of education, the architect behind the federal educational standards that had helped shape curriculums across the country. From the highest academic circles to the classrooms of underserved communities, Dr. Bennett's influence was felt. But here, in this small town, she was just another citizen with a parking ticket. The irony wasn't lost on her. The bailiff called her name, snapping her out of her thoughts. Dr. Ava Bennett. She stood, smoothing down the wrinkles in her professional blazer, and walked to the front of the courtroom. As she approached the bench, she took a deep breath. The room was silent now, all eyes on her as she stood in front of Judge Robert Hale, a man with a reputation for strictness and little patience for those who didn't follow the rules. Judge Hale looked down from his bench with a furrowed brow, his eyes scanning over her quickly. He didn't recognize her, of course. She wasn't the type of person he'd ever encountered in his years as a judge. At least, not in this context. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, noting that she was well-dressed, poised, and confident. Still, to him, she was just another person who had broken the rules. His voice was calm but authoritative when he spoke. Dr. Bennett, I see you've been ticketed for parking in a no-parking zone. The fine for this violation is $200. Do you have any reason to contest this? Dr. Bennett was momentarily taken aback by the casual tone with which he addressed her. There was no acknowledgement, no curiosity, no recognition of the life's work that had shaped entire generations of students. She considered contesting it, explaining the situation, but instead, she took a deep breath and calmly responded, "No, Your Honor, I admit it was a mistake." The judge nodded, not bothering to look at her again as he scribbled something on his notepad. "Very well," he said. "You'll pay the fine, and this case will be closed." With a quick motion, he dismissed her. It was all over in seconds. No questions, no second thoughts. He had moved on to the next case before she could even fully absorb the words he'd just spoken. As Dr. Bennett quietly turned and walked out of the courtroom, she felt an unexpected pang of frustration. But it wasn't just because of the fine. It was the way her existence, her work, and everything she had accomplished had been reduced to nothing more than a formality. The door to the courtroom swung shut behind her. It had been a simple mistake. But today, the world felt smaller than usual. Judge Robert Hale sat back in his chair, his gavel tapping absent-mindedly on the side of the bench. He had been on the bench for nearly 2 decades, and his days were often filled with mundane cases like this one. Small fines, speeding tickets, parking violations. Most of the people who passed through his courtroom were local, ordinary, everyday folks who, in his eyes, were simply caught up in the routine of life's small missteps. To him, they all blurred together. And today, Dr. Ava Bennett was no different. He glanced down at the sheet in front of him, where her name was written in neat professional lettering. He hadn't recognized her immediately, though he hadn't made much of an effort to either. She looked like she belonged. A well-dressed woman in her late 40s, calm and composed, perhaps a local professional. The way she carried herself gave him the impression that she was someone who had the means to pay the fine without a second thought. Judge Hale didn't expect to see her again after today, just as he hadn't expected to see most of the people who entered his courtroom. This was the nature of his job, to handle cases quickly and efficiently, without letting anything distract him from the task at hand. As Dr. Bennett left the room, he felt no need to follow up on her case. There was no reason to believe it was anything but what it appeared, a simple parking violation that needed to be resolved with a standard fine. The truth was, Judge Hale didn't think much about the people who appeared before him. It was a matter of efficiency. The court had its procedures, and it was his job to enforce them. Whether the person standing in front of him was an average citizen or someone with a much larger role in society didn't concern him. Rules were rules. He moved on to the next case, calling another name from the list. It was all business. To him, the courtroom was a machine, and each case a cog in the system. In the back of his mind, he was already thinking ahead to his next hearing, to the next person who would come through the door with their own set of issues and violations. A speeding ticket, a missed court date. The pattern never changed. In fact, when the bailiff handed him the next file, he barely glanced at it. The names were just names, after all, each one a person who had broken the law in some way. There was no need to get bogged down in the details. A judge's role, he believed, was to apply the law, not to dig deeper into the lives of those who appeared before him. If the law was fair, it didn't matter who you were. But what Judge Hale didn't realize, what he couldn't know from the brief encounter in his courtroom, was that the woman he had just fined had shaped much of the educational system in the very country he served. She was a force of change and innovation in a field he would never fully comprehend. In the coming days, he would come to learn that Dr. Ava Bennett was far more than just another defendant with a minor violation. And when he did, his assumptions would be shattered, leaving him to grapple with the consequences of his own oversight. Dr. Ava Bennett's name didn't just echo through the halls of schools across the country. It resonated in the offices of policymakers, in boardrooms, and at national education conferences. The educational standards she had helped create and shape had fundamentally altered how the U.S. approached teaching. She was the architect behind the federal guidelines that had introduced more inclusive curriculums, redefined how classrooms were structured, and championed equitable access to education for students from all backgrounds. As a child, Ava had always loved learning, but her journey into the world of education wasn't a straight path. Born and raised in a small town, she had seen firsthand how deeply inequalities in the school system affected her peers. By the time she finished her doctorate in educational policy, she had already been involved in various grassroots initiatives aimed at helping disadvantaged students. But it wasn't until she was recruited by the Department of Education in her early 30s that she truly began to make waves on a national scale. Ava had quickly gained the respect of policymakers for her innovative ideas. She wasn't just pushing for change. She was outlining it, designing frameworks that were both practical and visionary. Her standards focused on providing every student, regardless of their zip code or background, with access to high-quality education. It wasn't just about textbooks and tests. It was about fostering environments where every child could succeed, regardless of the barriers they faced. By the time she was in her 40s, Dr. Bennett's work had become the cornerstone of federal education reform. Her standards guided everything from teacher training to the way schools were evaluated, ensuring that schools met a set of criteria aimed at promoting inclusivity and addressing systemic inequalities. Schools that had once been neglected now had the resources and frameworks they needed to provide meaningful education to their students. Her policies made waves not just in academic circles, but in the lives of millions of students who now had a chance at a better future. But despite her profound influence, Ava had always remained humble. She didn't crave the limelight, didn't need public recognition. Her focus was on the work, the students, the teachers, and the long-term impact her changes would have. Even though she was a key player in educational reform, Ava had kept her profile low outside the academic and political circles. Most people outside the realm of education wouldn't know her name. And that, perhaps, was the key to her quiet strength, her ability to change the world without seeking applause. As she sat in her office late into the evening, preparing for the next wave of meetings and consultations, Ava reflected on how little people truly understood the impact of her work. She had never expected a simple parking ticket to become a catalyst for exposing the disconnect between what people saw on the surface and the deeper, more powerful currents that shaped society. But today, in a small courtroom, that was exactly what had happened. What had seemed like an ordinary case was, in fact, an ironic twist of fate. She had just been fined by a man who had no idea who she was or what she had done for the country's education system. And she couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if he knew the truth? Dr. Ava Bennett walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the fine still hanging in the air. The brisk winter wind greeted her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her heels clicking against the pavement in steady rhythm. She didn't feel anger, though there was a sense of disquiet. It was more the absurdity of it all. A parking ticket. $200. A small, insignificant matter that would have come and gone unnoticed by most people. But to her, it felt like more than just a ticket. It was a reminder of the smallness with which people saw her, despite her accomplishments. Ava wasn't one for vanity, but she had worked tirelessly over the years to build something that mattered, to create educational standards that would help generations of students, especially those from underserved communities, achieve more than what their circumstances would suggest. And yet here she was, a woman who had influenced policy on a national scale, treated as nothing more than an ordinary person who made a mistake in parking. She breathed in deeply, feeling the cold air fill her lungs, and let it out slowly. There was no point in letting this bother her. She had bigger battles to fight after all. She would pay the fine, move on, and focus on her work. This small moment didn't deserve her time, nor her energy, but there was a part of her, a small part, that couldn't shake the irony of it. The same system she had spent years working to improve had just dismissed her, as if she were no different from anyone else. Ava's thoughts drifted back to the courtroom. The judge had barely looked at her. No, he had not looked at her at all in the way one might look at a person whose life had touched so many. She had stood there before him, and in that fleeting moment, she felt invisible. It wasn't the fine that stung. It was the fact that, to him, she was nothing more than a name on a case file. No curiosity, no recognition, just a box to check. Still, Ava was used to this. She had always been one to stay in the background, to let her work speak for itself. Her contributions to education, while monumental, had never been about seeking attention. She had known from the beginning that true change didn't happen by chasing accolades. It happened by making tangible differences in people's lives. Yet moments like this, moments where her impact seemed to be lost on others, made her wonder if the sacrifices she had made, the long hours spent crafting policy, had been worth it. But she knew the answer. Of course, it had been worth it. Every step forward, every student whose life had been improved because of her work, was enough. And yet she couldn't help but feel that this was a reminder to her, perhaps a small one, but one that couldn't be ignored. That the fight for recognition wasn't just for the big moments, it was in the little things too. As she reached her car, she stopped for a moment. She'd deal with the fine, yes, but this experience, this would stay with her longer than $200 ever could. Days passed, and the minor incident in the courthouse seemed to fade into the background of Dr. Ava Bennett's busy life. She returned to her office, buried in work, and threw herself into her passion for educational reform. The conversation she had been having with fellow experts and policymakers about improving school systems across the country were the only things that occupied her mind. The fine. It was just an inconvenience, one she had shrugged off with grace, as she did most things that didn't require her immediate attention. But in the small town where she had been fined, the story didn't fade so easily. A local reporter, Emma Lawson, had been covering routine cases in the courthouse that week, getting small snippets of local life for her weekly column. Emma's task was simple enough, highlighting the mundane and occasional interesting moments in town. She'd seen Dr. Bennett's name on the court docket and hadn't thought much of it at first. A parking ticket, no big deal. But something about the woman's name lingered in the back of her mind, so she decided to follow up on the case. After all, it was rare that someone from outside the town ended up in the courtroom. When Emma sat down at her desk later that day, she did a quick search on Dr. Bennett. It wasn't long before she realized that the woman who had been fined in that little courthouse was no ordinary citizen. In fact, she was someone whose work had changed the course of education for an entire nation. Emma found herself stunned as she sifted through articles, interviews, and reports about Dr. Bennett's groundbreaking contributions to federal education policy. Emma was no education expert, but the more she read, the more she realized just how significant Dr. Bennett's work had been. She wasn't just a professional. She was a pioneer in the world of education reform, the mind behind many of the federal standards that helped reshape classrooms, curricula, and the way students were taught across the country. Dr. Bennett's standards had made classrooms more inclusive, equitable, and accessible to students of all backgrounds. Policies that encouraged diversity in curriculum, supported teachers with more resources, and redefined how schools assessed success were all shaped by her vision. Her name wasn't in every textbook, but her influence had seeped into every classroom. The irony hit Emma like a ton of bricks. A woman whose work had impacted millions, whose legacy had touched every part of the education system, had just been dismissed with a fine for something as trivial as parking. The more Emma thought about it, the more she couldn't shake the idea that there was something wrong with the way the situation had played out. This was no longer just a routine story. Emma knew she had stumbled upon something important. She immediately reached out to Dr. Bennett, hoping to get an interview and uncover more about the woman who had quietly shaped the future of education. She wasn't sure if Dr. Bennett would be open to talking, but Emma felt a strong urge to tell the world who she really was. She just hoped it wasn't too late. The story that Emma Lawson had stumbled upon quickly gained momentum. What started as a simple follow-up to a parking ticket turned into a media firestorm. Emma's article, titled, "Who is Dr. Ava Bennett? The Woman Behind Our Education Standards," was published the next morning. It didn't just detail the bureaucratic oversight of a minor fine. It unraveled the stunning truth of who Dr. Bennett was and what she had done for the nation's education system. Emma's piece highlighted Dr. Bennett's pivotal role in creating federal education standards that were designed to improve accessibility and equity for students across the country. The local paper's circulation skyrocketed after the article hit the stands. Emma's phone rang nonstop with calls from other journalists, radio hosts, and television producers eager to talk about the woman who had been quietly shaping the future of American education for years. The story was picked up by national outlets, and within a day, Dr. Bennett's name was trending online. People were shocked by the revelation. How could someone with such a profound impact on society be so easily dismissed in a courtroom? For Dr. Bennett, the storm of attention was overwhelming. She had never sought the spotlight, preferring instead to remain behind the scenes, making changes through policy and advocacy rather than fame. Her work had always spoken for itself. But now she was being thrust into the public eye in a way she hadn't anticipated. Though she didn't seek recognition, there was a strange feeling of vindication in seeing the world learn about her contributions. It was as though she had been fighting a long, hard battle for equity in education, and in a strange, unexpected way, this parking ticket incident was the spark that finally shed light on her legacy. As the story spread, many in the education world expressed disbelief over how someone who had done so much could have been treated with such casual indifference. The reactions were mixed. Some felt embarrassment for the court's oversight, while others used the incident as a chance to talk about the systemic issues that still existed within the very institutions Dr. Bennett had worked so tirelessly to reform. Her colleagues, mentors, and peers in education rallied around her, showing public support and calling attention to the long-standing impact of her work. Meanwhile, Judge Robert Hale, who had initially dismissed Dr. Bennett's case, found himself at the center of an uncomfortable media spotlight. Local news outlets began questioning how such an oversight could have occurred. How could a judge not recognize one of the most influential education reformers in the country? Some local commentators began to point out that there might have been a deeper, more systemic issue at play. Why had Dr. Bennett's significant role been overlooked, even by someone in a position of power like Judge Hale? A few days later, the phone rang at Dr. Bennett's office. It was a call she had anticipated but wasn't sure she was ready for. The judge wanted to speak with her. He was embarrassed and wanted to offer a personal apology. Dr. Bennett sat at her desk, her fingers gently resting on the edge of her keyboard. She hadn't yet decided how she would respond to him, but she couldn't help but reflect on how a single, small mistake had now turned into an opportunity to address much bigger issues. The world had learned her name, but was it too late to repair the small, deeply personal cut that had been made that day in the courtroom? Judge Robert Hale sat at his desk, his head in his hands. The weight of the media attention had become unbearable. His name had been plastered across every newspaper, news broadcast, and social media platform. The reporters had zeroed in on the irony of the situation. A judge who had fined the very woman responsible for reshaping the nation's education system, someone whose work impacted millions of lives, and yet in his courtroom was treated like any other minor offender. The first few days had been filled with a mixture of disbelief and frustration on his part. He hadn't meant any harm, hadn't realized the gravity of the person he was dismissing. It had been a simple parking violation to him, no different than the countless others he'd ruled on in his long career. But now, the full extent of the situation was inescapable. He had overlooked someone who had worked tirelessly for decades to ensure that children, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, received an equal and quality education. To make matters worse, he hadn't even thought to look beyond the ticket to understand who Dr. Ava Bennett really was. The phone call that morning had been a turning point. It was the local news station, requesting an interview to discuss the story. Judge Hale had politely declined, realizing that speaking on the matter publicly would only add fuel to the fire. But the questions, the critical voices, and the public backlash weighed heavily on him. He knew he needed to make it right. It was then that he decided to reach out to Dr. Bennett. He wasn't sure what he was expecting from the conversation, but he couldn't ignore the responsibility he felt. He needed to apologize, not just for the fine, but for the way he had dismissed her as insignificant. The phone rang, and Elva picked it up, her voice calm but cautious. "Hello, Dr. Bennett," Judge Hale said, his tone softer than usual. "This is Judge Robert Hale. I've been thinking a lot about what happened in the courtroom the other day, and I want to offer my sincerest apologies." Elva was silent for a moment, processing his words. She had expected some kind of follow-up, but she wasn't sure what kind of apology she was going to get. The truth was, she hadn't thought much about the judge since the incident. She had been too focused on the larger narrative that was unfolding, a narrative that, in many ways, had become about much more than just her fine. "I appreciate your apology," she said, her voice steady. "But I think this goes beyond one mistake. It's about understanding the deeper layers of who we are as individuals and the roles we play in the larger system." Judge Hale nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I understand now. I didn't see it in the moment, and I regret that. I've learned a lot from this, more than I ever expected." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy. But in it, Ava realized something important. This wasn't just about the fine. It was about what this moment represented. An opportunity for the judge to recognize how his actions affected the bigger picture. "I hope you'll take this as a chance to learn," she continued. "We all have blind spots, myself included, but the important thing is to recognize them and grow from them." "I will," he said quietly. "Thank you, Dr. Bennett. I won't forget this." As Ava hung up the phone, she sat back in her chair, reflecting on the conversation. It hadn't been an easy exchange, but it had been honest, and, in its own way, it was the first step toward a deeper understanding for both of them. The days following her conversation with Judge Hale were quieter for Dr. Ava Bennett. The media buzz had slowly started to die down, though it lingered in the background. She had been interviewed multiple times, and her story had spread far beyond the confines of her professional circles. Ava had never craved the spotlight, but now she was being recognized for something she hadn't expected, a parking ticket that had exposed her contributions to the country's educational landscape. Despite the attention, Ava felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had addressed the moment with the judge, and she had shared her story with the public. But there was more to it than that. The underlying themes of equity, recognition, and the systemic issues in institutions like the judiciary had become the conversation. It wasn't just about her work in education anymore. It was about why such oversight could happen in the first place. Why had a figure like Dr. Bennett, who had shaped so many lives, been so easily dismissed? It wasn't just a failure of one man. It was a failure of the larger system to recognize the contributions of those working behind the scenes. But Ava wasn't bitter. In fact, she found a certain peace in the events that had unfolded. What had started as a small incident had blossomed into an opportunity to raise awareness about the ongoing fight for equity and inclusion, not just in education, but in all aspects of society. And that, to her, was the real victory. It wasn't long before she was contacted by various organizations, eager to partner with her on projects that furthered her mission. Her story had brought attention to the need for greater transparency, recognition, and support for those whose work made a tangible difference in the world. Ava began speaking at events, sharing her insights into how society could better value the contributions of those who often went unnoticed. She spoke about education, yes, but also about the value of giving credit where it was due, whether in courts, schools, or workplaces. Meanwhile, Judge Hale found himself facing an unexpected shift in his own perspective. The media attention had been difficult for him to bear, but it had prompted him to reflect on his role, not just as a judge, but as someone who played a part in a larger societal framework. He had started looking more closely at the people who came before him, asking questions and seeking to understand their lives beyond the surface. He attended conferences and read more about the educational reforms that had shaped the nation. He even reached out to Dr. Bennett a few times, offering his support for her initiatives. Months later, Dr. Bennett received a letter in the mail. It was from Judge Hale. In the letter, he thanked her for showing him a different way of thinking and promised to continue growing from the lessons he had learned. The apology he had offered over the phone had been genuine, but this letter, more than anything, showed how deeply the experience had affected him. It was an acknowledgement not just of his mistake, but of the change he was now committed to making in his own life. Ava smiled as she read the letter. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It symbolized growth for both of them. In the end, the incident in the courthouse had sparked something much larger than any parking ticket could have. It had sparked change, a change that Ava could see in herself, in Judge Hale, and in the world around them. And that, she thought, was the real power of recognition.